Well, hi there. Welcome to week 2 of the course on the Trinity. This lecture is going to be about On the Way to Personhood. The second lecture this week is going to be talking about the God as a person. So in which ways can we consider God as representing or being a part of personhood? But here we're going to talk about how we're getting there, like how do we get to this idea of personhood. So we're going to be talking about some developments in the Trinity in the early church especially. Before I do that, I want to move into the course structure a little bit and talk about how I've organized the course. This course is formulated to start with sort of modern doctrines of the Trinity and modern ways of thinking about the Trinity, and then move back into historical formulations. Why are we doing it that way? Well, I want to emphasize that doing it this way, making the move of starting with modern and moving back into the ancient stuff, is important for us so that we can avoid the mistake of making the Trinity about theologica rather than oikonomia. The doctrine of the Trinity quickly fell into really abstract hands, as you read about in the readings for last week. And we want to make sure that we avoid those same moves when we do things today. And for that reason, I think it's really, really important to get a more modern way of thinking about the concepts in mind so that we can see how they were moving, perhaps accidentally even, into those abstract ways of thinking in the past. One of the things that's definitely true is the way in which the ancients thought about stuff like substance and personhood was very different than we think about it today. And so if we go back to that ancient material and start reading it, we have the potential of really thinking about substance and thinking about personhood in ways that are very modern instead of ancient. If we start with the modern stuff, we start with the work that modern theologians have done to retrieve the doctrine, then we'll be less prone to those sort of mistakes. Additionally, I want to make clear the position of the social trinity. The social trinity, which is what Lacuna operates under, that is not a modern formulation. Most scholars credit the Cappadocians, who were roughly contemporary with Augustine. Most of them credit the Cappadocians with coming up with the social Trinitarian model. And Augustine came up with a competing model called the psychological model. And in the psychological model, Augustine said the Trinity is like a person. A person has a soul and rationality, so the soul is the seat of reason and rationality. A person has a mind, which is the seat of knowledge. And a person has love, and that love unites together all those pieces of the person. So that's the psychological model of the Trinity that Augustine used to talk about how was the Father, the Son, and the Spirit operated together. Ultimately, this was built on a substance ontology, in which we really only know things based on what kind of substance they are, right? The soul is the seat of reason, the mind is the seat of knowledge. The social model, on the other hand, acknowledges that what we really know is only known in relationship to other things. We know about fathers and sons not primarily in terms of substance. We do know about them in terms of substance, but not primarily in terms of substance, but primarily in terms of social relationship. And so it's my belief that for the early church, substance language and social language were actually very closely related. That is not necessarily the case in modern times. And so as modern theologians have done work on the Trinity in the 20th and 21st centuries, they've gone back to this very early social Trinitarian model to find their inspiration, to see like, oh, this didn't operate just as these ideas about substances moving around. They conceived of substances in a relational way, and so we can too. We can retrieve the doctrine of the Trinity from abstraction by talking about it in a social model. Yeah, so I believe that the social model is the best way to keep the spirit of what the early church was doing, and it makes more sense as to why we talk about the Trinitarian God in 3 persons rather than as 3 substances. So let's kind of move into some things. Theologica and oikonomia. Why does God do anything? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why did God make creation? Why does God redeem creation? When creation went wrong, why didn't God just wipe the slate and start over again? Why was redemption important? And if God is a Trinity, and if the Trinity exists as an eternal community in relationship in which the persons glorify each other and delight in each other in eternal bliss, right? It's a theological concept that God is eternally blissful in himself because of the relationship of the Trinitarian persons. If God is eternally blissful, why did creation occur? Well, that's a really interesting question. Why would God have created? And to answer that question, we've got to move into questions about what it means for God to be a free agent. What does free agency mean as it comes to God? Well, sometimes we think about freedom in terms of doing whatever we want, right? You can just do whatever you want. You can crash your car. You can then go buy a new one and then crash it again and then restore other cars, right? That way of thinking about freedom is called free will of disposal. We can use our will to dispose of anything as we please. And the more power we have, right, if we are impoverished, we don't have free will of disposal to go and buy delicious meals and then throw them in the garbage, right? We don't have that power. But as we rise in power with money, with social standing and stuff like that, we have more and more free will of disposal until you end up with a monarchy, right? You have this king or queen, or if you go back to societies like ancient Egypt, we have these people operating as gods that can do whatever they want, and they can change their minds on a dime, and all these things can happen because they are ultimately free agents. But what I want to say is that God does not operate with this concept of freedom. I believe that this concept of freedom is tied to our fallen state, where we want to do whatever our wills say, right? And so we can change our minds about things. Consistency does not have to be important. God isn't God because God can do whatever God wants. Right? That's not the kind of freedom that God operates under. God is God because God does do whatever God wants. Ultimate freedom is not free will of disposal to do whatever you can cook up in your mind. Ultimate freedom means being truly free to be yourself, to follow your character. God doesn't have to choose what God's going to do when he wakes up in the morning. God just follows his character. That is the ultimate freedom of God. So, ultimate freedom is the freedom to be yourself. And God expresses the divine character, and the church has historically believed that the divine character is expressed in three persons. That is God's divine character. And those three persons are creative. They're loyal. They express love to one another. And so our concepts of those things, like loyalty, like love, like justice, like forgiveness, those are not extra ideas that God somehow is able to appeal to as God goes around forgiving and loving. No. Christians believe that God is love, that everything we know about love is fundamentally an expression of God's character. God is justice. God doesn't appeal to this idea of justice outside of himself. No, God is justice. God is forgiveness. These are fundamentally expressions of God's character. And so, why did God create? It wasn't like God woke up one morning and just decided that today of all days God was going to create. Fundamentally, Christians believe that God is creative in God's character. And so God was expressing his character whenever creation sprang into being. God didn't wipe the slate clean with creation. Not because God was exercising his free will of disposal, because God is fundamentally love. God is fundamentally redemptive. God is expressing character and forgiveness. So these are why there's something rather than nothing, and why the trajectory of creation has taken the path that it has. So let's move and talk about Plato and divine substances a little bit. I don't know if you learned about this at all in your theology courses, but in the ancient times, the ways in which they thought about how creation operates, or the cosmos operated, was through kind of a Platonic paradigm. And this Platonic paradigm said that ultimately if you have a chair, right, that's just an example of a chair. And if you go higher and higher in what it means to be a chair, ultimately you end up in heaven with the ultimate chair, right? The supreme chair from which all other chairs are defined. And these things were called ultimate or supreme substances. Sometimes they're called forms as well. You might have heard of the Platonic forms. But this drove people to think about things in terms of substances, that somewhere there existed a chair that was so perfect that it could not be more perfect, and all other chairs flowed from the idea of this one chair. Um, Plato, though, was a polytheist, and so the fact that there are all kinds of gods of chairs and gods of tables and gods of lamps and everything else, that wasn't really a problem for Plato to have all these kinds of competing forms floating around. But Christians believed that there was one singular creator God. There wasn't a whole bunch of forms from which God was pulling the idea of creation. There was a singular form, or there was a singular God from which all of creation sprang, through whom all things came. And so an adaptation of this idea of how the cosmos operated was needed. They couldn't just pull Plato off the shelf and apply Plato full form to Christianity. They had to adapt and make some modifications. This, by the way, is an extremely common thing that we do even today. The field of psychology didn't exist before Freud sort of invented it in the early 20th century. And so now we talk about all kinds of things in terms of psychological health, mental health. This is one of the ways in which, as we adapt and change and our worldview changes, we also adapt how we think about Christianity to it. This is a natural part of the process. But one of the things that I'll caution us about is there is a healthy and an unhealthy way to do that. And one of the points of courses like this is to sort of teach us to how to put up guardrails and to think clearly and distinctly about the dangers in our adaptations. But as you read and become more familiar with theology, you'll see that these adaptations are happening all over the place. That's not a reason to be scared or to doubt these men and women who are doing this. This is more a reason to up our game so that we do it well. So Christians believe that there was a singular creator God from whom all things came, and so an adaptation to Plato's divine substances was needed. And so, instead of thinking about all pieces of creation, rocks, lamps, tables, computers, you name it, as following some ultimate form in the heavens, instead, God himself was thought of as an ultimate form, an ultimate substance, in a very Platonic way. And so this is one of the ways in which things start to go wrong. Whenever you think about God as the ultimate form or the ultimate substance or the most divine of all substances from which all other things spring, you start to think about how it is possible for all other things to spring from such a substance, which immediately takes us back into the realm of theologica, thinking about what it means for God to be God in and of himself. And Jürgen Moltmann, a 20th century theologian, of whom I'm kind of fond of his work, Jürgen Moltmann discusses that one of the ways in which theologica goes wrong is by conceiving of God as an ultimate substance. When we think of God in a Platonic way, we do things wrong. That the divine ousia, right, substance, language, or homoousios as it comes to the Son, is the fundamental principle by which we think about God. And so as a result, we come to have analogies about God in terms of substances. And so just as we can manipulate substances or describe substances, then we can kind of do the same thing to God. God operates this way, and so if we do this, God responds that way, right? If we do evil, God responds with wrath. If we if we have a pure substance and we heat it up, then all the dross comes off the top. But God is so pure that no dross ever comes out. Right? We start to use analogies like that about how we think about God, and then we start doing things about, well, substances move and they bump into each other. So maybe we can think about God in terms of an ultimate substance where all the substances in creation bump into each other, and if we can reverse the clock and see what bumped into what to lead to the current condition, we can go all the way back in time and find God as the prime and ultimate mover. He was the ultimate substance that moved or prompted other things to move. We start to have analogies by which we think we can start to describe or prove the existence of God. But this is the problem of thinking about things at the level of theologica. God can't be proved by tracing creation back to some primordial state. We can't do that. Instead, we know things about God based on how God has showed up in creation. based on how God reveals himself in creation. That is the basis by which we know God. Not in terms of thinking about creation as a bunch of substance analogies, but rather by how God has reached out to us in relationship. How did God start this process with Abraham? It was through a relationship. He didn't say, Abraham, you really should have thought about how these substances were bumping into each other. No, God said to Abraham, I give you a promise, right? I will take you to a land. I will make your children numerous. That relational promise is the start of how Abraham came to know God and the basis on which many of us now know God as well, right? Through that relationship with Abraham that came through David and ultimately Jesus. How do we know things about God? Well, God the Father revealed the Son through the incarnation. And through the Son, through that relationship with the Son, we have come to know God the Father. Once again, this is not a substance analogy. And as a matter of fact, if you try to apply a substance analogy to it, it starts to break down. Rather, this is a conversation about relationships, about revelation, about how we understand things at the level of social interaction and relational interactions. God the Father has both revealed the Son and the Son revealed the Father. And this is why hypostasis is important. So we're going to talk about hypostasis here on the next slide, but hypostasis is hypostasis is this idea that's often translated as persons, but I think is probably best translated as individual reality or uniqueness. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But historically, we have thought about this revelation, this relationship in personal terms, right? In specific personal terms, even. We specifically have a relationship with Jesus, right? The Spirit comes and reminds us specifically about things that Jesus did and specifically about greater things, right? We specifically come to the Father through the Son. These are relational elements that drive our knowledge of who we are through what has been revealed to us through the presence of God in creation and in salvation history. All right. So I want to argue that we know things about God relationally through specific, unique, and distinguishable relationships as contrasted to other things. So let's talk a little bit about Arianism and the controversy that it caused. So we've talked about God as the supreme divine substance and said, really that's talking about God at the level of theologica. God is instead fundamentally relational and is the basis on which all relationships and all social interactions are even possible. And so I want to talk about that here as well. I'm looking for something on my slides, guys. I'm sorry about this. I had an analogy about gold here somewhere that I don't see. I'm wondering if I'm missing a page in my notes here. In any case, I'll go ahead and move on. One of the things that I wanted to say about gold is whenever we talk about things in terms of substances, especially in the modern day, we end up at a level that's maybe too intimate to that substance. So let's talk about gold, for instance. If we talk about gold in and of itself, we end up talking about things like nuclear composition, the ways that gold might react or not react. We end up talking about how it's shiny, its chemical elements, its things like that. But that is very limited in helping us understand how gold functions in our lives. The substance of gold is really defined in relationship to things. Gold doesn't easily corrode, and so we think about gold as a symbol of incorruptible things. We form wedding rings out of bands of gold to say that this is an incorruptible, continuous ring of love energy that represents, this bond of marriage that's supposed to be unbreakable. We plate our electronics in gold so that they don't corrode. Ultimately, the value of gold and how we think about gold is in relationship to other things, rather than a substance ontology about gold. One of the things that I want to argue here as well is if we think about God as a supreme divine substance, we can often go wrong with that. If we instead think about God fundamentally relationally, that opens up all kinds of space to understand God as the one who gives promise. God is the one who sends the Son. God as the one who is sent in the Son. God is the one who reminds us of all the things of Jesus in the presence of the Spirit. So fundamentally, thinking about God in relational terms really opens up the field of theology and really opens up Trinitarian doctrine to interaction and importance in the modern age. So let's move into Arianism and Trinitarian formulation and the problem that Arianism caused. So Arianism, you might know this from your theology courses, was an early controversy within the church, whereas this person by the name of Arius was thinking about Jesus and trying to figure out the relationship of God the Father to Jesus the Son. And Arius ended up arguing that Jesus was not God. Jesus was not fully divine. Rather, Jesus was a created being by God who shared some sparks of divinity, but was not fully divine and was not eternal. Arius is very famous for saying there was a time when the Son was not. In other words, there was a time when the Son didn't exist. The controversy around Arianism in the church was so great that they ended up having to have a council, the Council of Nicaea, where they debated this issue and tried to come up with some hedges, right? Some guardrails, some borders around which we could think about God the Father and God the Son. And one of the things that they argued was that the Son is not of a similar substance as God. That was one of the things that Arius argued. The Son is not a similar substance. The Son is of the exact same substance as God, homoousia with God. That is extremely important concept and will probably end up on your vocab quiz later on. The Son is of the same substance as God. And this is one of the ways in which they talked about things in terms of substance ontology, right? We don't care about substances that much these days. We're not obsessed with how much of God the Father's substance the Son shares. Rather, we are interested in the status of the Son relationally to the Father. But the reason that it was important for them to come up with the same substance concept is to say, relationally, Jesus the Son is fully God, is fully divine. There is no subordination in Jesus' divinity. There's only a subordination of status in the realm of the incarnation, where Jesus empties himself and becomes lower than God in that. But then they were also faced with the fact that we didn't want God the Father and Jesus the Son to be the same thing. Right? I, as a person, I'm a father, I'm a teacher, I'm an employee of a company, I'm the son of my mom and dad, I'm a brother to my sisters. And so putting on those different hats depending on what I'm doing is called modalism or Sabellianism, something you probably also learned about in your theology courses. And so they wanted to hedge against the ideas of Sabellianism as well, that there is only one God who just puts on different masks or operates in different modes. Rather, they wanted to emphasize that these were two distinct agents or energies. So, ousia means substance. Hypostasis in that time also meant substance. And these two words, ousia and hypostasis, were often used interchangeably, back and forth. You could just interchange them in sentences and the sentences would mean the same thing. Instead, in Christianity, they started to use the term homoousios as a technical term that did not mean substance in the same way that the word ousia meant substance, but hypostasis instead meant person. That's how it made its way into Latin as the word persone. And that's made its way into English, right? We think about one God in three persons, right? That comes from this word hypostasis. But really the way hypostasis was supposed to act as the outcome of the Council of Nicaea was not necessarily our modern idea of person, but rather an idea of uniqueness. There is one substance in three uniquenesses. There is one substance in three individual realities. Sometimes they use the word energy as well. There is one ousia, one substance in three energies. three centers of will, things like that. So I want to argue that the word hypostasis being translated as person is not the best way to think about the word hypostasis. Rather, if we think about hypostasis in terms of individual realities or uniquenesses or energies, that might help us out somewhat in figuring out how Trinitarian doctrine actually operates. I have a quote here by Justo Gonzalez, a fantastic church historian. He says, the distinction between ousia and hypostases is the same as that between the general and the particular, as, for instance, between the animal and the particular man, if you consider man an animal. Wherefore, in the case of the Godhead, we confess one essence or substance, ousia, so as not to give variant definition of existence, right? In other words, to say we have one substance so that we don't fall into the trap of Arianism. But we confess a particular hypostasis, a particular uniqueness, in order that our conception of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit may be without confusion and clear. Right? In other words, we can't confuse the Father with the Son. They are not the same thing wearing different masks. They are unique and different. This, by the way, I believe, is Gonzalez is quoting from Basil of Caesarea, one of the Cappadocians who helped come up with our Trinitarian doctrine. They used hypostasis as a technical term to mean uniqueness. So at Nicaea, substance language, ousia, was used to describe relational and social concepts of the Trinity. Right? This substance was meant to describe how God could exist relationally to, how God the Father existed relationally to the Son. They are of the same ousia, but they exist in different hypostases. So, they did this so that they didn't fall into the same trap as Arianism or Sabellianism. Now, when approaching a personhood, the matter of homoousia was settled at Nicaea. But when we ended up with three, there was a problem. And so hypostases was presented to try to clarify how it is we could have three uniquenesses, but one ousia. The point of all this is that it's not a substance like a lump of gold that we appeal to in the generic. Instead, we as Christians appeal to specific uniquenesses, hypostases, that make its way into English as a person. So we don't talk about God as a substance in and of itself, right? Again, that would be like talking about gold in and of itself. That's a kind of a meaningless distinction. Rather, we talk about God as God exists in unique relationships to things, as creator and redeemer, as the one who delivers us, the one who saves us, the one who forgives us, the one who gives us a hope and a future. Those are all relational terms and not substance terms. Now, hypostases, as thought of in terms of personal agency, is a unique use of the term. We've discussed that already. And how this term has come to describe the personal nature of God is the topic of the next lecture. In what ways can we consider God a person? Is God a person? So that's both the topic of chapter 8 of Lacuna, which we'll read, and I'll try to unpack that in the next lecture. So until then, I hope you all the best, and I will see you in these videos soon. Thank you.